Good morning. It's nice to be able to speak to you this morning. When I signed up for this weekend, the circumstances were much different, of course, and I miss you. If we're going to have a time together, it would be nice to be able to be together when we do it. I'd like to ask a question this morning. What do you do when your world falls apart? What do you do when you face the unexpected? What do you do when the world that you've known forever, or so it seems, gets ripped away? These last few months have been quite a ride. One week, back I think it was in March, we were meeting for worship, and all of a sudden, our buildings are closed and regular worship services suspended. Personally, it's affected me because in all of my life, I've not missed 9 or 10 or 11 or 12 weeks in a row, whatever it's been, that we haven't been in church. When I grew up, when I was even a little kid, there was never any question of what we were going to do on Sabbath morning. It's been a difficult journey, to say the least. And now, as we start to look toward reopening, the challenges are still there. A new word, at least a new word or a new phrase for me, social distancing, is now the watchword. Businesses are starting to open, especially on the Idaho side of the border. Schools transferred for the remainder of the school year to live streaming. And we have to wonder, even as they're opening it up, is it going to go closed again? Will another spike take place that will make us back off of where we are now? And those kids who were graduating from 8th grade or kindergarten or 8th grade or high school or college or whatever don't get the regular graduation service this year. It's certainly different than what they had expected. Yes, COVID-19 has impacted all of us. My personal family has been impacted in an unusual and unanticipated way by the virus. As many of you know, my wife and I, daughter Janelle and her family live in Australia. Last year, our son-in-law, Nathan, accepted a job flying for a medical retrieval company, and the main area where they work is in Asia. And so they were out to visit us. They came across, visited us part of December, part of January. And then they went home, packed up their things, crated up a big crate of their belongings, and shipped it to Malaysia, to Kuala Lumpur, where they're planning to live. The day after they shipped the crate, everything was shut down. They can't leave Australia. Their transition is on hold. Their belongings are in Malaysia, and they're camping out in their house in Kurrambong in New South Wales, Australia. They weren't planning for this. And my daughter even mentioned to me once, she said, "Dad," she said, "don't have an emergency because we probably can't get over to be there with you in that case." They're stuck over there. We're stuck over here. Now, while our plight in general may not be that dramatic, we don't know when things will be back to normal, whatever normal means. We aren't even sure what normal will look like. Some of us don't know if there'll be enough money to pay the bills. You know, sometimes they talk about the economy. Sometimes it isn't the world economy or the U.S. economy that we're worried about. It can be our own personal economy that we're concerned with. We simply don't know what the future holds. Our personal world can fall apart as well. I just read recently of an acquaintance, a young single mother, 39 years old, with a cancer diagnosis. Obviously, that turned her world upside down. Some in this congregation may have lost a spouse, may have lost a friend, may have lost a loved one of whatever, and it turns our world upside down. Some may have lost their jobs. Some of you may have lost your jobs, and you're not sure where the money will come from to pay the bills. Yes, our world on many levels has fallen apart. It was a dark, dirty, damp, stinky place. Not a place designed for humans. Not an inviting place, not the kind of place you would choose to spend the night. Not a place for humans. To top it off, this dungeon of sorts was full of big, hungry lions. In the midst of these hungry lions was an 85-year-old man. He found himself in a place he certainly didn't want to be, one he would never have anticipated. Earlier, when he had contemplated his fate, his entire life must have flashed before his eyes. Maybe this would be the end. Apparently, his life was over. Now, how in the world did Daniel find himself in this situation? You already know the answer, but it is worth contemplating because of the implications it holds for today. It's during uncertain situations that I am drawn to the stories in the book of Daniel. A few years ago, I related some of those stories to you. But Daniel lived his entire life in a world that had fallen apart. How he coped with that world will be instructive to us today. Yes, we know the story. Most of us, or many of us at least, have probably learned the story before we were able to read. It's a wonderful childhood story, and it bears repeating today. Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they should be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. One of the first things I notice, and it's very interesting to me, is how Daniel had survived the overthrow of the Babylonian Empire. He had served King Nebuchadnezzar all through the years. And generally, when a new king came in with a new empire, he would execute all the people that were loyal to the former government to make sure that they weren't going to turn against him. But Daniel, here he was working for the new king, and how did that happen? How could he do that? I don't know for sure, but perhaps Daniel's reputation preceded him. Undoubtedly, Darius had heard of Daniel and his work in Babylon. Perhaps Darius was aware that Daniel had interpreted the handwriting on the wall for Belshazzar. I don't know. Perhaps Darius knew that Daniel had predicted the coming of the Medo-Persian Empire. We don't know the complete background for sure, but we do know that Daniel was chosen to aid the new king. Ultimately, I believe God preserved Daniel in order for Daniel to introduce Darius to the living God. Verse 3. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. I find that fascinating. Daniel, a captive from Judah who had served his entire adult life as an administrator in Babylon, was set to become the prime minister of this new Medo-Persian Empire. If that's where the story ends, we would say, wow, what a wonderful story. But now the story takes an unexpected turn. Professional jealousy takes over. The other administrators aren't happy with the king's plan to promote Daniel. They're determined to get rid of him. But how? Verse 4 tells us that they looked for some ground of accusation against Daniel with regard to his work for the king. All they needed was one nasty tidbit. But as verse 4 says, they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. That's a true dilemma these conniving leaders had. Surely if they looked hard enough, they could find something. Fast forward to today. Today, there's always some dirt on a leader, always something that he or she can be accused of, or so it seems. These men finally concluded, as verse 5 tells us, we shall not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. His character is squeaky clean, no dirt, no scandal, no misappropriation of funds, nothing. But wait, maybe that very quality character is a way to get rid of this guy after all. And so it is in their determination that they come up with a sinister plot. And yes, it does have to do with his clean character. It has to do with his relationship to his God. They have noticed Daniel doesn't work on Saturday. He doesn't frequent the pagan temples. And he prays exclusively to his God. And I guess I have to be honest and say, in my mind, I always ask myself the question, if someone wanted to find dirt on me, something that I had done that was wrong, some character flaw, whatever it might be, would it have to be in relationship to my God? I could hope it would, but I don't know. Verses 6 to 8 outline these scheming people's idea for getting rid of Daniel. A delegation, it wasn't the whole 120 of them, that would have been too many, but a delegation from them, I assume, go before the king. They outline a plan that decrees that no one can petition any god or man for 30 days other than the king. They must have suggested to Darius that this was a way to make sure that everyone was loyal to him and to his new kingdom. After all, the king did not want to suffer loss. They stated that all the commissioners and satraps were in agreement that this was a good law, a good idea, a good proclamation for him to make. They made sure that the king agreed that a law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be revoked. They wanted an airtight plan, of course. And the penalty that they suggested? Anyone who refuses to comply is cast into the lion's den. They get the king to sign the proposed decree. Now, in an oral society like Medo-Persia, anything written down and signed added significance. Once written and signed, it could not be changed. And verse 9 says it. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is, the injunction. He signed without recognizing the full implications and without recognizing the hidden agenda. He assumed this decree would bolster his kingdom and his authority. He assumed that his leaders wanted what was best for him. I kind of picture these shrewd, or they thought they were shrewd, commissioners and satraps as they leave the king's presence. They are jubilant. Why? They know they have their man. Why? How do they know? They know Daniel well enough, and they know his commitment to his worship of his God well enough to know that he will not change course simply because of this law. That is why they didn't want any wiggle room in the decree. They knew what Daniel would do, and they sensed in general terms that the king might not be delighted if he knew their real intent, so they wanted to make sure that their case was airtight. It's at this point that once again, Daniel's world falls apart. I picture it this way. I picture him getting up in the morning, having his breakfast and his prayers and everything else, and then going down to the street and walking over toward his office in the palace or wherever his office was. And as he walks along, I picture a guard or somebody coming along with the proclamation, "The king hereby demands that all citizens make their petitions and prayers only to the king for the next 30 days. Wow. That was new. How would Daniel respond to this? How should he respond? Verse 10 is the key verse in the chapter, I believe. Oh, there might be 2 or 3 others that would be just as key, but this one really is significant. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. So, how did he react to this new edict? I suspect when he heard the proclamation from the guard, he knew immediately what the purpose was. He had been left out of the loop. He didn't know anything about it, and yet he was about to be prime minister, so he knew that his enemies were up to no good. But the Bible tells us that he entered his house and continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day. As one commentator has put it, Daniel did not begin the practice in defiance of the king's order. He continued his daily devotions without interruption. In fact, he did not do anything new in reaction to the decree. It says he prayed toward Jerusalem. He didn't open the windows in order to be seen. They were already open. He prayed toward Jerusalem for all the time, every day, and he continued that practice. If you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 36 to 39, you find Solomon's directive aimed to God, asking God to be with them if they've drifted away from Him, that they could look toward Jerusalem and expect to have salvation, and maybe to expect that God would let them come back to Jerusalem. I always like to point out that he did not go out in the middle of the street and show his defiance of the king's directive. He didn't say, hey, everybody, I want you to know I'm not going to follow the king's directive. I think it's wrong, it's ill-advised, I don't like it, I'm not going to do it. He didn't do that. He didn't close his windows either, or simply go down into the basement. He didn't simply pray in his private bedroom. He simply didn't let an ordinance of the king change his course of action as it related to his God. It says he gave thanks. He prayed and gave thanks. How do you give thanks to God when anticipating hungry lions with open jaws and grinding teeth staring you in the face? Daniel simply gave a silent witness to his commitment to his God and his belief that no matter what was going to take place, that his God would be with him. Let's go back in Adventist history for a minute. Some early Adventists around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, some early Adventists in their enthusiasm for the truth believed they need to work on Sunday even when blue laws were in full effect and prohibited Sunday work. And then I took this from Arthur Spaulding's book, Origin and History of Seventh-day Adventists. I quote, "Some Seventh-day Adventists felt that they must preach the true Sabbath by chopping wood in their front yards as their neighbors went by to church, or by hanging out the washing on Sunday morning where the preacher might take it for his text. One brother in Maine, whose business was railroad construction, craving for more emphatic protest against the Pope's Sunday, set off a charge of powder under a rock ledge at church time. Miscalculating, however, he produced an explosion that shook the town, whereupon he thought it prudent to retire to the forest primeval for a while." And then Spaulding goes on to say, these were not exactly lunatic fringe, but perhaps in the order of Simon Zelotes among the disciples. End quote. Eventually, Adventists took the counsel of Ellen White. When the people were moved by a power from beneath to enforce Sunday observance, Seventh-day Adventists were to show their wisdom by refraining from their ordinary work on that day and devote it to missionary effort. 9 Testimonies 2:32. And then just one more from Prophets and Kings 5:42. In all cases where the king had a right to command, Daniel would obey. But neither the king nor his decree could make him swerve from allegiance to the King of Kings. It was only in relationship to his God and what he was prohibited from doing that would be part of his regular worship to his God was the only thing that he would draw a line and say, no, I can't follow that. While his enemies were scheming, Daniel was praying. Daniel prayed 3 times a day no matter what was going on in his life and around him. He had been doing that for a long time. It was his pattern. When he felt powerless, he resorted to prayer. In fact, long before this plot was formed against him, he had found prayer to be the vital ingredient in his busy life in Babylon as a high-ranking official. The believer knows all too well that it takes less effort to pray during an emergency or trial than in the course of ordinary life. May I point out that when our world falls apart, prayer, our connection to God, is an essential key to coping and to moving forward. The commissioners and the satraps observed Daniel once the decree is signed. I sort of picture them maybe that same day or the next day. They huddle around somewhere nearby where they can observe him. And Daniel doesn't disappoint them. Immediately they see him praying to his God. I don't know if they watched it 2 or 3 times that day to make sure that the pattern was still there, or whether they only watched it once. I really don't know. But immediately, they bound off to the king. They review the law and its consequences with the king. And the king agrees, yes, I've signed it. Yes, it cannot be changed. And so then they inform the king, as verse 13 says, Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Verse 14. Then, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed, set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Immediately, the king knows the real reason for the decree. Immediately, he sets out to deliver Daniel. He works all day to come up with a solution, a way around the decree, some way to save his trusted friend. But all the lawyers in the empire cannot find a way out. Eventually, the king is forced to admit defeat. And so reluctantly, the king gives orders for Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den. It's interesting to note that the king implores the God of Daniel to protect and deliver him. Verse 16, "May your God that you constantly serve deliver you himself." And thus Daniel was cast into the den, a stone was placed over the opening, and it was sealed. The king couldn't sleep that night. He had been tricked by conniving leaders that he could no longer trust, and he had lost his most faithful leader, Daniel. He couldn't sleep. The commissioners and satraps didn't sleep that night either. At least I don't think they did. First of all, they were celebrating their victory. But they might have not have slept well for another reason as well, because they had watched the reaction of the king and he was not happy with them. And that didn't bode well for tomorrow. What about Daniel? What do you suppose Daniel was doing that night? I believe he's the one with the potential to have a good night's sleep. I picture him feeling completely safe among the lions with God's angel at his side. Now, he probably had a conversation with God's angel. If I had an angel with me, I think I'd want to ask him some questions and have some conversation. But eventually, I think I picture him. The Bible doesn't say this, but I picture it this way. I picture Daniel so comfortable, so confident of his God that he lays down and goes to sleep using one of the lions for a pillow for his head. The next morning, the king gets up early, rushes to the lion's den. He goes in haste, presumably to find out if God has saved Daniel. It's absolutely fascinating to me that he calls out to Daniel when he gets to the den. He calls to Daniel in a troubled voice, "Has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Now, if any of his advisors were with him, I think they would figuratively scratch their head and say, "Wow, what's happened to the king? Is he crazy?" After all, no one can survive the night in a den of hungry lions. Darius wants to know if Daniel's God is able to deliver Daniel, something the king tried to do, but unsuccessfully. Daniel's response is powerful. "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me. I was found innocent before him, and I've done you no harm." Quickly, Darius happily gives orders for Daniel to be removed from the lions. No injury was found on him. It sort of reminds me of the 3 Hebrews a number of years before, when they were brought out of the fiery furnace and there was no smoke, no singeing, no nothing. They were just the way they were when they went in. What was the reason that Daniel was saved in the lion's den? It was his unfailing trust of God. Now, verse 24 makes something else very clear. The lions were hungry. The king orders all the men who had schemed against Daniel, along with their wives and children, to be thrown into the den. Let's just say they didn't fare very well in that awful place. And so to come back to where we started, in some ways our world has indeed fallen apart. Most everything that was normal 2 months ago doesn't seem to be normal now. We miss the routine we're used to. We miss Sabbath fellowship with our friends and family at church. We might miss going out to our favorite restaurant. We miss going to work or working with our colleagues. We fear getting sick with COVID-19. We fear the future because the future is so unpredictable. In our story today, Daniel demonstrates what it means in Isaiah when it says, "Be still and know that I am God." With all the turmoil around him, with all the conniving and jockeying to destroy him, even with the threat of the lion's den, he found himself simply letting God have control of his life. He didn't allow the circumstances to mess with his relationship with his God. 3 actions on his part made him successful. First of all, he praised God. He kept his connection with God in that sense of the word. He had no doubts about who God was or whether God was with him or not. He praised God. Secondly, he prayed to God. He kept the connection going. He didn't alter that prayer life of his in any sense of the word. He may have prayed longer, I don't know. He may have prayed deeper, I don't know. But he continued what he'd always done, and he continued praying to his God. And third, Daniel trusted God. Whatever the outcome, he trusted God because he knew that God was with him. And he did all 3 again, as I said. He did all 3 as he had always done. When I look at the life of Daniel, I think that some of the problems that we face today and some of the uncertainty and all the rest, and when our world falls apart, it doesn't even look quite as bad compared to what Daniel went through for a whole lifetime. So in the same way, when our world is crumbled, when things aren't going the way we would wish, we need to give up control and simply give our future to God, knowing that He will take care of us, knowing that He will save us and see us through. As the old song says, He's got the whole world in His hands. He's got the you and me brother and the you and me sister in His hands. I came across a song, the words of which was a new song. I wasn't familiar with it, but I came across it and I liked the words because I think they're apropos to what we're talking about today. It's sung by the Collingsworth family. You can find it on YouTube if you'd like to listen to the song. And the name of the song is Fear Not Tomorrow. I'd like to read the words. In this age of uncertainty, questions come to mind. What is waiting ahead for me and the rest of mankind? Fear not tomorrow. God is already there. He's charting the course you take. He sees each hidden snare. He's waiting to guide you through each burden and care. Fear not tomorrow. God is already there. Are you troubled o'er things to come? Is your future unsure? Are you dreading the coming dawn, a long day to endure? Fear not tomorrow. God is already there. He's charting the course you take. He sees each hidden snare. He's waiting to guide you through each burden and care. Fear not tomorrow. God is already there. Many things about tomorrow I don't understand. But I know who holds tomorrow. And I know, yes, I know who holds my hand. Fear not tomorrow. God is already there. He is already there. Let's pray, shall we? Father in heaven, I thank you so much that God is already there and tomorrow. I'm glad that you're there, that you can anticipate the future. You can anticipate the future of each and every one of us. And although we can't anticipate that future, although we can have struggles and problems and fears and concerns, help us to put our trust in you so that we can go into the lion's den or whatever else that might have to happen and know that you'll be with us. May we know that God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. And may we remember to be still and to know that you are God, that you will be exalted among the nations, that you will be exalted in the earth. And I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.